Amanda with Eat, Pray, Crunch. Welcome to my backyard. It is a beautiful day today, and I thought it could not be a better day than to film outside. So that is where I am, that is what I am doing. So this is a video I've been wanting to film for a long time to tell you my story. I have opened up about some other aspects of my health in the past. I made a video talking about my history with anxiety. If you want to see that video, I will link it here. I also made a video talking about my Ehlers Danlos syndrome. If you want to see that video, I will link that one here. I'll also put them in the description down below. So I've opened up a little bit about my health struggles in the past, including mental health stuff. It's been, what, 4 years now, and I still haven't made a video since I got a diagnosis, but here I am, better late than never. This couldn't possibly be a more ADHD thing than to film a video about ADHD 4 years after getting a diagnosis of ADHD. Procrastination, anyone? So that is what this video is about. I'm going to talk a little more about my anxiety and also talk about my ADHD diagnosis that I received in the summer of 2018. But it was something that I had been suspecting for a while, and I went and sought a diagnosis for myself. Having neurodiverse children is really motivating in examining yourself and your mind and your heart and doing some self-reflection and figuring some things out about yourself. And that's kind of why I was exploring it in the first place. Anyway, at the time I was diagnosed, I wrote basically a small essay on my experience of growing up undiagnosed with ADHD and then how I came to figure it out later in life as an adult. This will be a little different than my other videos in that I'm not just talking at you, but I'm actually going to read what I wrote to you because I feel like I covered everything in that essay a lot more thoroughly than I could remember to cover it just talking at you. So bear with me, I'm going to read it to you. And I'll say some side notes along the way if I need to. I am a firm proponent of talking openly about mental health for the sake of normalizing it and removing the stigma. I guarantee 100% that you or someone you know is affected by a mental health struggle of some kind. In fact, I think it is safe to say that everyone struggles with their mental health at some point in their lives, if not chronically. It is much more common than you might think, and it is pretty ridiculous to pretend to hide it and pretend like you never struggle with anything for the sake of maintaining a certain image, because really, who actually lives up to these ideal images of our lives that we try to portray on the world, especially on social media? No one. This is my story. Last month, I wrote this in 2018, so I say last month. Last month, I was diagnosed with inattentive ADHD. Basically ADD without the H, as an adult at age 34. Getting this diagnosis has probably been one of the most affirming things that has ever happened for my mental health. It makes pretty much every mental health struggle I have ever had make perfect sense. I had a very happy, healthy, fun, and stable childhood, but I was prone to anxiety, especially social anxiety, from the time I was very young. Ironically, in kindergarten, my teacher noticed that I was very distractible and spaced out a lot, or would focus on one thing for a long time. At one point, she gave me a simple assignment to finish without a time limit, and I spent the entire rest of the day working on it. They had a psychologist come into my class and observe me for an hour, and they determined that I did not have ADD. My family always just thought ADD was the en vogue diagnosis of the 80s and 90s. Perhaps it was because they started understanding it so much better in those decades. The negative side effect of this was that society developed the stereotype of ADHD that most people still think of now. The hyperactive boy that is loud and disruptive and bouncing off the walls, that grows out of it by adulthood. I was none of those things. I was a very quiet, compliant, goody two-shoes who strove to fit in as much as possible, and as my school years went on, I seemed to get by in school. So this whole idea that I might have ADHD was completely dismissed. I even spent half of my life resenting my kindergarten teacher for thinking that about me. Fast forward back to the present. So I also wrote In 2017, when Alex got his autism diagnosis, I wrote a little essay about that as well, so that's what I'm referring to here. Last year, you probably saw my note about Alex receiving his twice exceptional 2E diagnosis, gifted with high-functioning autism. Going through that process of figuring out what was going on with him and getting that diagnosis ended up being just as much of a learning curve about myself as it was about him. When you are faced with your child receiving a mental health diagnosis, it causes you to take a good, hard look at your own mental health. During that time, I did an awful lot of introspection and research, really taking the time to gain a deeper understanding of all the various types of neurodiversity. For a while, I even wondered if I was mildly on the autism spectrum, like Alex, because there were a number of traits that I was surprised I identified with, especially in how it presents for females. Things like extreme social anxiety, liking things to be familiar and routine in my life, executive functioning difficulties, hyper-focusing on special interests, sensory issues, especially sound and smell, clumsiness, highly sensitive, feeling things very deeply, and stimming, or fidgeting. What's the difference anyway? But then I thought I couldn't be autistic because I intuitively understand social norms pretty well, even when I don't like them. I'm not super literal. My first thought in my decision-making process is always how it will affect others. I am quite social, even though I have social anxiety, and I've always had a group of friends, albeit small. My social abilities didn't quite fit the bill. Then I stumbled across an article about how there are a large number of people who fall into what they call the broader autistic phenotype. This means that there are people out there who exhibit autistic traits mildly enough that it is more like a personality type than crossing the threshold into disorder. That seemed to fit me, since I had some of the traits, but not all, and not so strongly that they affected my ability to function. But that wasn't the whole picture either, so I kept digging. I decided to revisit ADHD, even though I spent all those years being offended at the thought that it might be something that applies to me. I knew that I didn't fit the stereotype, but maybe there was more to it than the stereotype. I dug into researching ADHD. I was surprised at how little I actually knew about it, and I was surprised that the ADHD stereotype is only one type of ADHD. There are 3 types: hyperactive, inattentive, and combined. I was surprised to learn that the hyperactive type tends to affect boys more, and the inattentive type tends to affect girls more. I was surprised to find out that because of the ADHD stereotype, boys have been grossly overdiagnosed and girls have been grossly underdiagnosed. An estimated 50 to 75% of girls and women with ADHD are currently undiagnosed. Yet another example of the medical world basing a whole diagnosis on male presentation, just like autism and heart attacks. I also learned that girls tend to work much harder than boys at fitting in and being compliant, which very often makes their mental health struggles invisible and go undetected for years. I learned that ADHD and autism have a lot of overlapping traits, hence why I identified with so many of the traits, and that they are both considered to be neurodiverse conditions. Both can have sensory issues, hyperfocus, and executive functioning struggles, but the defining differences seemed to lie in intuiting social norms and repetitive behavior. ADHDers seem to struggle a bit less in those areas. I learned that ADHD really is a bad name for it. It isn't so much attention deficit as it is attention dysregulation. People with ADHD have this amazing gift of hyperfocus, which is the ability to get so intensely focused on one thing that any awareness of time disappears, which is called time blindness. This can be a superpower when it's channeled into something productive. It can be a curse when it's being used to procrastinate rather than doing a task that needs completing. People with ADHD are interest motivated rather than time motivated. A light bulb was starting to go off in my head. I looked more into the female presentation of ADHD, which is finally beginning to be better studied and understood. ADHD girls tend to be daydreamy, distractible, fun-loving, chatty if they're extroverted, disorganized, cluttered, indecisive, night owls, intelligent, creative types, have hyperactive minds even if their bodies are hypoactive, and struggle with chronic fatigue, take much longer than average to complete tasks, procrastinate to the extreme, often run late, experience time blindness, or frequently lose track of time, approach tasks with all or nothing mentality, etc. There's usually a breaking point that leads a woman to seek a diagnosis, a point when her life reaches a level of complexity where she is no longer able to keep up. For me, my breaking point has been motherhood. Women with both autism and ADHD almost always get diagnosed with depression and anxiety first, which happened to me. I was diagnosed with anxiety first. But depression and anxiety is a secondary symptom that results from toiling so hard to keep up and fit in. This was absolutely the case for me. I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder a couple years ago and have been on an anti-anxiety medication since. I didn't realize then that anxiety alone wasn't the full picture. The more I learned about inattentive ADHD, the more all of the puzzle pieces fit, and the more my whole life made sense all of a sudden. My kindergarten teacher had been right all along. I finally forgave her and let go of that grudge. I now know that having ADHD is not a bad thing, and it is actually pretty prevalent. I think about how through my elementary years, my school and family life created all the structure I needed, so I didn't need to create that structure myself. I was blessed to have parents who sat with me and tutored me and walked me through so much of my homework. Even then, though, I had anxiety about time tests and getting things done on time, as well as social anxiety. My anxiety presented as stomach aches as a kid. At home, I was all or nothing about my living space. I was either super cluttered and messy, or I hyper-focused on cleaning and organizing it. But it wasn't consistent. My parents can attest to the fact that while I was an angel child in most ways, when it came to chores, not so much. That was always the biggest battle they had with me. I was so disinterested in doing chores that I had a giant mental block, and it was like pulling teeth to get me to do them no matter the reward. In middle school, more was expected of me to create my own organization, but I managed to pull it off by pulling all-nighters in middle school. I remember pulling my first all-nighter in 7th grade because I had procrastinated on a large project until the last minute, and I stayed up all night finishing it at age 12. I got a stellar grade on the project though, so nobody was the wiser. Looking back, that was not normal. My difficulties with time management continued on into high school. I was smart enough to do some IB honors classes in the subjects where I excelled. Those worked out well for me because I was interest motivated and I was able to channel a lot of my hyper-focus into them. I pulled a ton of all-nighters in high school though to get it all done. My folks used to tease me for studying all the time, even on Saturday nights, instead of watching movies with them. I remember trying to read sometimes and nothing was processing in my brain. I would read the same sentence over and over and not know what I read. I would eventually have to read it aloud to myself for it to register in my brain. Looking back, this was me working 10 times as hard as my peers to pull off good grades. All that effort paid off though, and no one was the wiser because I pulled off almost all A's and B's. When the time for taking the SATs rolled around, I did horribly. I think I got an 8 or 900 or something like that. I felt so discouraged because I felt like it wasn't testing my knowledge as much as how fast I could answer the questions. I did so horribly because I only got through half to 2/3 of the questions before the time was up. I took an SAT class and my score tipped a little over 1000, but not much. Looking back, time tests are killer for ADHD brains. In spite of my shoddy SAT score, I got into my rigorous liberal arts college of choice because they are thankfully a liberal arts college that values the whole person rather than a test score, and I was able to show who I was through more holistic criteria. I was shocked when I got my acceptance letter there because I thought I must have barely squeaked in. I felt like I wouldn't have gotten in if I had applied a year or two later. The first year of college was a utopia. The school creates all your structure for you that first year, which makes that initial transition easier. Leaving for college was one of the hardest things I've ever done, though, and for the first month or so, my anxiety was higher than it had ever been up to that point. I basically felt sick to my stomach from the anxiety until I settled in and got into a groove, and met some of my lifelong friends there. After that first year or two, though, a lot more is required of you in terms of responsibility. The work gets harder, you have to manage all your own time, and you have to start living independently and learning everything that goes along with that. Hello, rent, bills, groceries, and cooking. My anxiety got really, really bad my junior and senior year. I had to be decisive and choose a direction for my life. I chose a major in philosophy and a minor in elementary education with a teaching certificate. All throughout college, I pulled all-nighters to get everything done on a regular basis, then I would sleep all weekend to catch up. I wrote the first 30 pages of my philosophy thesis over the 3 months of the term. I wrote the second 30 pages in the 2 days before it was due. And I printed it off minutes before the deadline, and I literally ran it to my professor's office just in the nick of time. Thankfully, most of my college coursework was stuff I was super interested in, which is what kept me afloat and motivated through it all. But my anxiety was getting so bad that I was starting to throw up on a regular basis from the stress of keeping my head above water. I started developing some chronic health issues as well, which I later found out is my EDS, which you can see in the other video. I hit my lowest adult weight because I was struggling with my stomach so much. While a few people in my life knew about this, I hid it all very well and would suffer what I now recognize as panic attacks all alone because I didn't want anyone to see me that way, lest they think something was wrong with me. Newsflash, something was wrong. But I didn't want to worry the people who cared about me, so I suffered alone quite a bit. What's interesting, though, was that I learned years later that so many of my fellow college students were also struggling with depression and anxiety. But they were all hiding it amazingly well too. When I think about this now, why? Why is the topic of mental health so taboo that we are all suffering alone next to each other when we could have been supporting each other? That right there is the problem with mental health issues being stigmatized, and why it needs to be normalized and talked about. Nobody is alone in these struggles. I managed to graduate from college with all A's and B's nonetheless, so no one was the wiser. That fall, I went on to student teach, and that was when I had a major crisis. Being a public school teacher requires an incredible amount of organization and executive functioning skills, keeping track of a zillion details and about 30 kids with different needs, planning ahead, creating a lot of structure, managing time well. These demands were too much for my ADHD brain, and I broke. I had a complete mental breakdown because I just couldn't pull it off anymore when it came to juggling that level of complexity. And I became very sick and distraught. I realized that I didn't have what it took to be a public school teacher as much as I absolutely adored kids, and every job that I ever had was with kids. I quit student teaching a month early and decided to forego my teaching license. I felt like a huge failure. This was something that I was just incapable of pulling off. I thought I wasn't smart enough, organized enough, responsible enough. I felt like I was utterly failing at this whole adulting thing. I moved back home with my parents while I sorted out my life. I started seeing a counselor, which was helpful. That was the time that I came back to my faith and started listening to the still small voice again after ignoring it for several years. I started praying again and felt led to the holistic healthcare world and massage school. I felt like I was starting to get some direction in my life. After nannying for a couple of years, I saved my money and put myself through massage school, which gave me confidence. Massage school was so different than my college experience. I was fascinated with learning the amazing complexities of human anatomy, and it was obviously the most hands-on education I had ever had. I realized that I have a very kinesthetic learning style, and I was good at this skill. The tests in massage were not timed, so I felt like my knowledge was actually being tested rather than my ability to take a test quickly. When all was said and done, I ended up getting a 4.0 for the first time in my life and graduating at the top of my class with a fellow classmate. Massage school was a huge confidence booster for me. I started to feel like maybe I was actually smarter than I gave myself credit for. I just needed to be in the right kind of learning environment. After working in a clinic for a year, I started my own massage business. Figuring all that out was a huge confidence booster as well. I met and married the love of my life at that time, which made me feel loved and worthy and confident as well. Things were going swimmingly in my life. Enter children. Dun dun dun. Becoming a parent brings you to a whole new level of testing the limits of what you're capable of. Can I get an amen? It requires a whole new set of executive functioning skills, organization, and time management. While I felt like I was doing a pretty good job at being a mom, I also felt like my house was falling apart. Chores, once again, started becoming a huge mental block that I just couldn't get past. My living space became messier than it had been in a long time. Still is, with 3 kids. For a while, I fell trapped to the mom comparison game as well. I just could not understand how people with children went to bed at a reasonable hour. Night is the only time I could focus and get things done. Got anywhere remotely on time and kept their house clean. I couldn't fathom how moms were getting out of the house with their kids all the time. I felt so fatigued and lacking motivation so much of the time. My anxiety started building again. I often had to have a beer or a glass of wine after the kids were in bed because that was the only thing that would take the edge off. Then came the presidential election. I fell into the darkest depression and anxiety I had been in since my quarter-life crisis after college. It was so debilitating that I couldn't get out of bed. I had 2 kids to take care of, and I just couldn't. I had to have Bill stay home and have my parents come help with them while I went to the doctor because remaining in that state for an extended period of time was not an option with kids who needed my care. I finally broke down and went on an anti-anxiety medication that I had been trying to avoid for so long, but I felt like I had no choice. After a couple of weeks of rocky transition, I started to feel the all-encompassing anxiety start to dissipate. Then it went away completely. I was shocked. When it was finally gone, I realized how bad it had been and how long I had been living that way and what I had been missing because of it. I honestly wondered in that moment why I had waited so long. It was life-changing. When it came to better understanding my neurodiverse child, I came to better understand my neurodiverse self. I started to see all these traits in myself and reading accounts of other women with inattentive ADHD, and I felt like they could have been writing my story because I could relate to them on such a deep level. I strongly suspected that I had it, but I wanted to get an official diagnosis just for the sake of affirming and better understanding myself. I decided to go through a full evaluation at the local university and had a very positive experience. I went in for my follow-up appointment and I received my diagnosis. I was right. It wasn't all in my head. I felt so validated that all of the struggles I had ever had made so much sense. The clinician validated that I am much stronger than I gave myself credit for so long, and that I might be mildly twice exceptional myself with my ADHD. Apparently, this twice exceptional phenomenon is not uncommon among her patients, where they are very intelligent, but their ADHD makes them work significantly harder than everyone else, making them think they aren't that smart, and vice versa, that they are smart enough to compensate for the ADHD struggles. The result is that these patients appear to function at a very average level, even though they would be capable of a lot more if the ADHD weren't holding them back, because they have been able to pull off things at an average rate for most of their lives. Their struggles are often invisible and go undiagnosed. What's funny is that almost everyone in my life has been surprised to hear that I got an ADHD diagnosis because I don't fit the male stereotype. It just goes to show how effective my efforts to hide it have been. This is true for so many women. It is an invisible struggle. The diagnosis is not based solely on an outward behavior like it often is for boys. It is based mostly on the silent inward struggle. I'm looking forward to owning my neurodiverse brain and working with it in ways that are better suited for how it functions, harnessing the super abilities and gifts that come with it, and learning tools for how to cope with my struggles so that I can reach my full potential without being held back. So that is it. That is my story. I don't think that I could elaborate on that any more than I already did in my essay, because I spent a lot of time writing that and pouring my heart into it. So I think that covers my bases pretty well. The only thing that I don't discuss in my essay is starting medication. Unfortunately, because of insurance problems and the doctor we were seeing who was not comfortable prescribing ADHD medication and difficulty finding a psychiatrist who our insurance accepted, it was a whole big ordeal. I didn't go on ADHD medication until a couple years after receiving my ADHD diagnosis. So I think it's been 2 years now that I have been on Vyvanse, and guys, life changing. Being on anxiety medication and being on ADHD medication has been life changing. Now, I have completely done a 180 in my viewpoint about ADHD stimulant medication. I used to be like against it because I thought, oh, it's like one molecule away from being meth or whatever. But it is very, very well studied that stimulant medications given in therapeutic doses, all being regulated by your doctor, is the most effective treatment for ADHD in most cases. Not all cases, but in a very high percentage of cases. And that has been the case for me as well. I finally felt what it was like to have good executive function. It was shocking. I could have a task that I needed to do, have this thing in my mind that I needed to do, and just do it, instead of having to go through this enormous mental battle just to start it. And it's been amazing. I mean, I'll say that it's not a complete silver bullet. My camera died, so I'm using my phone now. So finish this video on here. Anyway, it hasn't been a complete silver bullet. Like, I still have some executive functioning struggles, but it makes it so much better. It makes it so that, going to counseling and learning the tools that I need to learn and the skills that I need to learn to work with my executive dysfunction, along with medication, make those tools more effective. So it has been life-changing in the best way possible. I can honestly say now that my mental health is better now than it has ever been in my entire life. And that is really saying something. Going on medication just made me realize how much I was struggling and suffering before. And it made me realize, this is how most people actually function all the time. Like, this is normal for people to actually be able to do things, without it being an enormous mental battle. Yes, so now I am a huge, huge proponent of trying medication if you get an ADHD diagnosis, because it makes a world of difference. So that is my story. And I'll probably talk about ADHD a lot more coming up on my channel. I recently told the story about how our daughter Sophie received an ADHD diagnosis, and actually our son Teo also received an ADHD diagnosis. It is highly genetic. Bill has it as well as high functioning autism. He's also twice exceptional. If you're interested in his story, leave a comment and let me know, and maybe I'll ask him if he would be willing to tell his story on my channel. So all these forms of neurodiversity, ADHD and autism, are very, very closely linked. It is highly genetic. So it's not surprising that all three of our children are neurodiverse. So yeah, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. If you guys have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I am always happy to talk about neurodiversity. It is one of my passions now that it is such a big part of my life and my family's life, and learning to work with it in a positive way so that we can be our best, most thriving selves that we can possibly be in the world. So anyway, thank you so much for watching, and if you haven't already, Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button down below if you're interested in seeing more content like this. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you later. Bye guys.